Hey there everyone, Afrodo Reviews here, helping you determine if that next book is worth reading over second breakfast or deserves the fiery pit of Mount Doom. So let's get started. The next book on our agenda, The Land. Mildred D. The Land was a book published on July 5th, 2000. Ironically, about 5 days before this review goes up. It was the sixth and penultimate book of the Logan family saga that began with Song of the Trees from 1975. Though the book itself is the first chronologically in the story, following the great-grandfather of the character named Cassie Logan in the future. I know the relevance after reading this, but like I said, in my TBR, I've never actually read anything that else in the saga, so I can't present you with a fair view on any of that. Though if any of them are written half as good as this, yeah, I'd pick them up. Originally, this book was meant to be the last book in the saga published, but following the release of All the Days Past, All the Days to Come in 2020, it no longer holds this title. The book also won the 2002 Coretta Scott King Author Award and the 2002 Scott Odell Award for Historical Fiction. On my copy, you can see the Coretta King Award right here, printed on it. Yeah, the Coretta King Award printed on it right here. I thought that was pretty cool. Anyways, as for my own personal experience, The Land for me is, I guess, a very important book. The book itself was my first real historical fiction that I actually enjoyed, that is to say. I remember when I first read it, I was instantly hooked because I was able to quickly identify with the main character, and it's for the strangest of reasons. You see, the main character, Paul-Edward Logan, is a mostly white-looking man who's a mix between white, black, and Native American, like me. That's exactly what I am. Mostly white, but I look mostly white, but I'm part black, Native American, Choctaw Indian, to be precise. At least that's what I was told. And white. German mostly. The book really opened my eyes, though, to what I would have experienced had I been born in the time that he was in, which, from what I could find, it was about in the 1860s up into about the 1880s or 90s, because it starts only a few years after the Civil Wars ended. Paul-Edward Logan was actually born into slavery, but before he could remember, the Civil War happened and freed all the slaves. So, yeah. One of the biggest things that Paul struggles with through the story is that he's too white to be considered black, and thus he's not accepted into that community. But he's also too black to be considered white, and thus he's ostracized from that community as well. So, yeah, it's just one of those books that really had a profound impact on me, simply because I could identify with the main character by virtue of the circumstances of his birth. And I'm going to apologize now as I dig deeper into the review. This one isn't going to have as many cutaways, at least not that I intend, because I just want to talk about this book a little more seriously. The subject matter this book deals with a lot is actually to do with racism, especially those back in the day. That is also I'm going to also warn you here. This book deals a lot with racism, like unflinchingly bad racism. So if you're sensitive to that kind of thing, I will be talking about it a lot. This is your warning. There's no really way to get you to skip past this, so I can't include a time code. So unfortunately, I'm just going to have to say, skip this video if you don't want to listen to me talk about that. With that being said, start with the review. And we'll start where we always do. The cover. Now, the cover is a simple enough work. You have art realistic enough that it seems like an old photograph of the two main characters, Paul-Edward Logan and Mitchell, standing side by side. And honestly, the cover design is really good. Like I said, it's like an old photograph. But if you look close enough, you can kind of tell. I think it's some kind of oil painting. I'm not too read up on the art world, so I can't just identify what kind of art it is by looking at it. For those of you who want to take a good look, maybe tell me. notice reflections. Point being, you get a good sense of proportion of the two as well while looking at this. You see how Mitchell's kind of standing closer to the front while Paul-Edward is a bit further to the back. Yet despite that, Mitchell is still almost a head taller than Paul-Edward, giving you a real good indication just how big of a guy Mitchell is. As well as the way they're standing gives you quite a bit about their character. You got Mitchell, who looks... Both of them are staring at you cautiously. Mitchell, who's kind of like gripping the head of his axe tightly and looks like he's about ready to fight you at the first sign of trouble. While Paul-Edward holds his axe in a slightly more relaxed stance, but you can kind of tell from his look, he's just eyeing you up, trying to figure you out, which fits really well with both of their personalities. The land around him is also wild and a bit untamed, and there's not much to speak about there, but it's nice to look at, and given what the story's about, it's a good background to have. It's clear that this is the goal of the book, is to get this land, or in some way to do with this land. I personally don't like the back too much, since it's just advertisements by listing the awards that the Mildred D. Taylor's other books has gotten. And while that's a good indication how the author writes, it doesn't tell me anything about this book. And as I've said before, the cover of the back of a book should tell you what the book is about, and worry about the acclamations of the author in smaller doses. I don't just read something because the author wrote it. I read it because it sounded interesting, which has gotten me into more one bad situation. Now, before we actually start the story, there is one thing I want to say. It's one of the few books that I'm going to recommend that you read both the acknowledgments and the author's note when you go through it. It gives you a good indication of how she came up with the idea and where the author was when she wrote this book. From the way she puts it, this book is almost like a memoir. It's written from the stories her family told her, as well as some of her own personal experiences. It isn't necessarily fiction so much as it is a bunch of stories pushed together on a fictional character that actually happened. Still, that being said, if you what I say here you like, I highly suggest that if you do pick up this book, read the acknowledgments and the author's notes. I don't typically read them, so that should tell you something. Now, the story itself is rather simple. It's a mixed-race boy named Paul-Edward Logan, starting from his young age, about 8, and venturing deep into his adulthood, following his journey to try to make a name for himself, as well as eventually get his own little piece of land. All while involving Mitchell, a kid who bullied him at first, who eventually becomes closer than most of his blood family to him, his real brother. It's kind of a found family kind of story. I do have to apologize to those of you who read my TBR. It'd been so long, I had actually thought Mitchell was an actual blood relative of Paul-Edward Logan, a bastard brother, but I was wrong. The brotherhood between these two is solely found family, and that's not to diminish it at all. I'm just putting that out there. I would like to correct myself because I made a mistake. The real meat of this story, however, putting aside that simple plot synopsis, is really the personal relationships and the social commentary of the times that Paul-Edward is in. It's definitely one of those books that seeks to talk about troubles that not just black people in the South suffered at the end of the world, but also the troubles of the mixed-race children that were neither accepted in black or white communities due to their mixed nature. One of the best scenes, personally, that emphasizes this to me is the time that Paul learned that despite the fact that he's grown up feeling that he's an equal to his white brothers, Robert, Hammond, and George. Robert's the important one, Hammond and George I just threw in there so you knew. He has to learn that in the world he lived in, he was, for all intents and purposes, still just a black man, in the eyes of many white people. This happens when Robert, in his growing age, about 12 or 13 I think, starts to socialize with known racist kids that neither of them liked when they were younger. He even states one time when talking to Paul that they were openly joking and bragging with a group that talked about how they hunted down and lynched a black person, and how he hated that they were just making light of that. That being said, he still wants to hang out with them and starts getting friendly with them for some reason, to the point where he invites them over for dinner, And while dinner's being readied by Paul's mom, Robert takes out Paul's horse, an Appaloosa. But he lets these two racist kids, named the Waverleys, ride it. But they don't know how to control a horse. So while they're riding him, they whip him real bad. And by the time Paul finds where they are, the horse is beaten, tired, exhausted. It's in real bad shape. Now Paul is angry because he loves horses and derides Robert for doing this. Robert is peer pressured by the Waverleys, punches Paul, and the Waverleys jump Paul shortly after Robert retaliates with a punch of his own. Now, despite this, Paul fights back pretty good, still kind of gets beat up. Only when he returns home and finds his father waiting for them after Robert told him what happened, his father is mad, but not at Robert. Again, as I said before, and this time it didn't really matter that Robert and his friends took out and abused this horse, hit him first, and then jumped him in a 3-1 fight. All that focused on is Paul, a mixed race kid, in the white kid's eyes, a black kid, hit some white folks. And his father basically whips him naked in front of all these white people simply to prove a point to him. It's a really tragic scene. And while you might understand how Paul's father would come to think that this is the best way he can save his son, that because, I mean, if Paul had done this to anyone else and his father hadn't done this, they might have formed a posse and lynched Paul. It's not out of the question that they would kill kids back then for something as stupid as that. It's basically, in his mind, it's either this or let Paul get lynched, now or in the future. But you also completely understand Paul's shock, disbelief, and the conclusion he comes to later that, in reality, although he's thought of himself as a brother to his white family, he's never going to be equal to them in this world. Not even really in his own family's eyes, despite what they try to say, because he's still, to them, a black kid. It's really tragic that Robert's the one who does this, because he was the brother that Paul was closest to when they were young. To the point we even get a small scene where Robert sits there and talks about how it doesn't make sense that he can't just say Paul's his brother out loud, because skin color is such a frivolous thing to get upset about, only to see him turn around and betray Paul like this. It's definitely one of those terrible moments. And like I said, this book is really unflinching when it comes to portraying the tragedy and pain that was caused back then by their racist beliefs. Sure, you have decent people here and there, like Madame Crenshaw, who her and her daughters are a group of white women who saved both Mitchell and Paul from being lynched by a mob after Mitchell knocks out a white man who stole a bunch of their money, effectively. Or Luke Sawyer, who Paul notes as the first white man who ever shakes his hand and treats him as an equal in a business. But in truth, this is history, and it's going to be uncomfortable and tragic to read at times because this is how people were treated back then. And if we take Mildred Taylor at her words in the author's note and acknowledgments, these are actual stories that happened to her family, to a degree. The book is also a good insight on how generational trauma can create this lasting effects on people. When Paul-Edward is apprenticing a black boy named Nathan who wants to learn the carpentry trade, which Paul is rather skilled at, Nathan begins to get close to another young white boy by the name of Wade Jamison, who consistently invites him out to go fishing. Now Paul, fearing that Nathan will undergo the same trauma he went as a kid with Robert, starts to warn Nathan off when the two get close, basically telling him don't trust him, he's a white guy. And there's a pattern where Paul, despite being introduced to otherwise seemingly friendly people, has trouble trusting and not thinking the worst of them because they're white. He flat out, later in the book, flat out refuses to be indebted to anyone of a white skin color. It even gets to the point where he can't trust his good friends to help him out because they're white. And he sees what happens when a white man who eventually comes to the conclusion that they don't have to keep his deal simply because he's black. In a sense, you get that same sense of distrust as well because you've been with Paul almost every step of his journey. And you understand why he thinks this way. If I did have a couple complaints about the book, it's that I'm not a fan of how it tells its story, which is in a out of chronological way at times. While it does fit the style the book is going for, which is like a journal, I guess, or a retelling of this guy's history, it just seems like it also feels unnecessary from a more objective point. A good example is when Paul leaves his home with the Crenshaws, the women I mentioned earlier who saved him from being lynched by a mob. Him and Mitchell. And the section ends with the implication that he's going to go work for them, training their horses. Only for the next section to immediately open with him and Mitchell working in a logging camp under very bad conditions. Only to get an explanation of what happened with the Crenshaws like 20 or 30 pages later. And at the time you would be mistaken into thinking that maybe the Crenshaw women lied to Paul and Mitchell and tricked them into hard labor. But no, this is just the course of life that Paul took after he got tired of working for the Crenshaws, and we're actually looking at something closer to a 2 or 3 year time jump between when he got on that train and when he's in this logging. It just sort of feels unnecessary, and like this could have been at the beginning rather than in a midway through the section. But it's a minor nitpick at best. Another small nitpick is occasionally the book will sit there and repeat to us information we already know. And while it is good character interaction when it happens, because it often happens in dialogue rather than the narration, it still is mostly just a repetition of what we've already read and figured out for ourselves. Honestly, if the characters weren't so well written, these parts would have brought down the book a lot. But otherwise, since it does have great character interaction in these sections, and they do sort of justify their existence near the very end of these little repetitions by giving us some information we weren't privy to at the time, though we could have probably guessed. They are pretty easy to read through. So again, a minor nitpick at best. So in the end, I would have to grant The Land a firm 9 out of 10. This book not only holds up to a reread with my more mature point of view, but honestly, having reread it, I think it's better than when I read it the first time. The Land is a book that a lot more people should read. You really feel for the struggles of the characters, and you truly get a sense of how unfair life was back then, not just for our biracial protagonist, but just in general if you didn't have the right skin tone. It certainly stuck with me as a kid who at that time was just happy if I could read Magic Treehouse, not quite that young, who just at the time would be happy if I could read the next Percy Jackson book. So if you know of a place with The Land by Mildred D. Taylor, or you've already owned the book but just haven't gotten around with it, I say stop what you're reading and pick this up, especially if you live in the US. That being said, with that book done, we move on to the next. And honestly, I'm hoping the next story doesn't have a lot of holes in the plot. But until then, remember, with every book comes an adventure, and every adventure is worth having, even the bad ones.